are 200,000 cold cases in the United States. They won't be solved with CODIS alone.
I was moved into our homicide unit in January of 2019, and it was actually the first case that I was assigned to work on.
I will learn about cases through emails or phone calls, and in particular, this was a call from a family member. And so once I got that call from the family member, I pulled the case file and started learning about the case.
It was a case that has plagued our community for the last 46 years. At that time, it was a Valentine's murder. And so therefore, it was on all of the news stations. Every year during Valentine's, they would show clips.
A teenage girl found dead after attending a high school dance.
In February of 1974, Carla Walker was a 17-year-old girl who went to high school at Western Hills High School in Bedford, Texas. There was a Valentine's Day dance planned for the 16th of February, which was a Saturday. And so she and her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy, attended that dance.
And after the dance, they decided to go driving around with some friends. And about midnight, they dropped their friends back off at the school. And Carla and Rodney went driving around, went back to a bowling alley they had been to earlier that night.
And they parked there because Carla needed to use the restroom. And Carla was abducted afterwards from that same bowling alley parking lot. When I say abducted, I mean a male came up to the car while she and Rodney were in the car, basically pistol whipped her boyfriend and took Carla away.
They found Carla 3 days later in a culvert by a nearby lake. I would have to say more than a dozen detectives have put their fingerprints on this case.
If they had some sort of a lead that they could chase down, they did. But when that ran out and they hit a dead wall, then they had to stop.
I found out how much this case meant to other detectives that had worked on this in prior years, and that they said that this was one case that they couldn't let go of and that they thought about often.
We did a show with Paul Holes. So we stayed in contact with Paul, and Paul mentioned Othram and said, hey, there's this new company, maybe you should talk to them and see if there's anything they can do.
I called David Middleman with Othram, told him what amount of DNA we had, approximately 4 nanograms, and I don't even think that's what ended up showing up at Othram. It was less than that.
The evidence in this case had already undergone testing at another laboratory, and the results were not successful, although a good amount of evidence was consumed. And so there was less than a nanogram remaining.
If you do one of those tests, a consumer test that involves perhaps a cheek swab or spitting in a tube, you're going to end up collecting enough material to generate somewhere between 750 to 1,000 nanograms. When you do the kind of testing we do at Othram, we're working from, we could work from a fifth of a nanogram.
We felt an urgency to get involved because the case had already been attempted using another method, and it had failed, and so there was very little evidence remaining. And if the evidence is fully consumed and there are no leads generated, then that's how a case truly goes cold forever.
We weren't real optimistic because we had already had a couple of issues where we couldn't get any answers from other labs. So of course we were going to be a little pessimistic, but David really gave us a comfort level.
We were very appreciative that they gave us the opportunity. The stakes were high because there was very little evidence left, but at the same time, we've processed other casework that was similar. We knew we'd been able to work with those kind of properties of evidence and get a good outcome, and so we felt reasonably confident that we'd be able to help them with their case.
This was pretty much our give it our all, go home or bust. And so we knew that to give us our absolute best chance at finding this person, we just needed to do what we needed to do.
There are a couple steps in the process from which we evaluate and then take on casework. We start with the extensive case review. We'll look at all the documents associated with the case, the previous lab reports, attempts that were made to analyze the evidence. And we do that because very often there's not a lot of evidence to test or use, and we want to learn as much as we can about what did and did not work in the past before we formulate a strategy for how we're going to get involved. At Othram, during our QC process, we look at 4 key parameters. The first parameter we look at is quantity of DNA, so how much DNA is actually available for testing. The second parameter is quality, and so we're looking at degradation of the DNA. So as DNA degrades, either due to age or environmental or chemical insult, the DNA goes from large, juicy segments to small and smaller pieces until the fragments are so tiny they generally are not accessible by most lab methods. And so quality could be an important parameter. We look at contamination with non-human sources. So older skeletal remains will have bacterial contamination and other traces of DNA from non-human sources. Our fourth parameter is mixture. So it's not uncommon in a sex assault, for example, for there to be DNA contributed by more than one individual, perhaps the victim and the perpetrator. And so understanding the properties of the mixture, how many people are in the mixture, what the ratios are, that goes a long way in helping us understand if a case is tractable and what the best strategy is for testing that evidence. We generally tell investigators for typical casework, we're looking at a 12-week period from evidence to profile. So that's the time period from which the evidence hits our doorstep to the time in which we are able to deliver a file that contains a profile that could be uploaded to a genealogical database for search or somehow analyzed further. And the next step once you get that profile is to do the research through public records, family trees, to figure out leads that might point to an identity for the unknown person. I don't think Detective Bennett was expecting a call from us. We called him on Saturday, July 4th, and we apologized for interrupting his holiday.
That phone call was probably one of the most fulfilling days of my life.
We were ecstatic. I mean, we didn't know what to do with ourselves because we're like, oh my gosh, it's really happening. We're really moving here. And we knew at that point that we were definitely going to solve it.
David called me and said, Jeff, I've got a last name for you. And he said, we've worked at genetic genealogy. And I was like, David, what's the last name? And he told me, and it ended up being one of the people that was on our suspect list.
I'm so thankful for the Fort Worth Police Department. The feeling that I had when I was notified, the word that came across my brain was finally. Finally.
Glenn McCurley, a 77-year-old retired truck driver, was living quietly with his wife in this modest home off Vickery Boulevard when police picked him up and booked him on capital murder.
He was 77 years old. So for the last 46 years, he's been able to live his life, have kids and grandkids, and just do normal people things. And Carla never got that chance. So to be able to take him off the streets was definitely a victory for us and for Carla's family as well, because he took away her ability to have a life, and yet he was able to have a normal one.
Solving a case of this nature, one that's 47 years old, is really a once in a lifetime event. And the feeling was overwhelming, and the satisfaction of being able to go back to the Walker family and tell them we found the person who committed this horrific act towards their sister and their family member was probably the best feeling of all.
We feel a connection to all the cases that we're involved in, and certainly will sympathize with the victims, their families and friends. However, when we approach casework, we try to approach it from the objective viewpoint of whether the scientific processes and technology we have will bring value. Our goal is to bring the most value to the most cases.
The optimism right now is just overwhelming. We've got so many cold cases. I know in Fort Worth, many other cities and jurisdictions do as well. And I think this technology is going to absolutely give us the ability to solve more cases going forward. Cases that we've worked on, we've gotten to the point where we can't move any further because of the technology we had at the time. So now this gives us the opportunity to go back and look at other cases where we were stuck and give us hope and optimism to be able to move forward and solve these cases as well.